Okay, let's get to the word. Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 72. It's a bit of a long read today, but that's okay. We're good with that. Here we go. And they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes, but Peter followed him at a distance. Right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none, because they had to have two. Back then, when they sought counsel, when they sought testimony, they actually did it right. They did it the right way, which was you needed two witnesses to come forward. They would put each witness in a different room and ask them to share their story against Jesus, and it had to line up. But these stories weren't lining up. That's why they couldn't find anything that was lining up. And it said, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Then some rose up and bore false witness against him even further, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. Now, to make any kind of a comment towards the temple of God, the holy temple, that was considered the highest blasphemy that you could do. Now, we know Jesus, when he made this comment, he was literally talking about his temple. And we see the transition there from the temple being this physical building housing the presence of God to the transition of the actual temple, the body, the human body, a living temple now being able to house the presence of God. We see this transition taking place, and Jesus, when he speaks of the temple, is actually speaking of his body. So they thought he was talking about the temple. But we also know that Jesus said, to one of his disciples back in the end of, I think, Mark 13, when he came across these buildings, was like, oh, look at all these buildings. It's amazing. And he's like, yeah, but these buildings, not one stone will be left upon each other. And we know that prophecy came true in AD 70. But this context here was in reference to Jesus' specific talk about his body being the temple of God. So we're all on the same page on that one, so we're good there. So they bore false witness against him, saying, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But not even then did their testimony agree, because they had to have two agreement. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, listen, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But he kept silent, and he answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, listen, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven, a reference to his second coming. Then the high priest tore his clothes, because this was the ultimate in blasphemy. He tore his clothes, and this is how they responded, and said, what further need do we have of witnesses if it's coming right out of your mouth? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him and to say to him, prophesy. And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. Now, as Peter, so we go back to Peter now. So all this story is happening, but it's prefaced by Peter being in the courtyard, sitting there, just warming himself by the fire. So we go back to Peter now. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, because if you look at how houses were set up back then, it was all kind of like a U shape with a courtyard. And so Peter made his way into this courtyard, was sitting by the fire. Now there's a whole, I don't have time to go into that detail per se today, but let me give you the Cole's notes on this one. Wake up. Here's the deal. Peter, it said that he, in one of the other Gospels says that as Peter went into there, they're like, well, how did Peter get into the courtyard with a high priest? Like, didn't the disciples all run away? Didn't the disciples, weren't they trying to get away from these, from these people? Didn't they want them killed and dead and stuff like that? How does Peter even end up in this place? And oftentimes you'll see in the Jesus movies, it's this cloaked guy who's like just this mysterious person. Nobody knows who he really is. And, it kind of seems to be right. The other Gospels go on to say that it wasn't just Peter that was there, but it was the other disciple that he loved. And so some of the disciples are thinking, hey, this is John. John is going with Peter, and somehow John knew the priests. Somehow John knew. But that doesn't make sense either, because if you go deep into the history of that one, I don't have time today, but you see that the congruencies just quite aren't there, because John and, knowing who the high priest was, there was no connection there. There really wasn't any connection. But then some scholars say, well, Peter, the other disciple, because it's mentioned in the other Gospels that the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and this is one of those, remember we talked last week about sometimes there's speculation in the Holy Scriptures because it doesn't say specifically. So you have to look at the context, you have to read the context, figure out exactly what's happening so that you can look deeper into the text. And so as we look deeper into the text, the only way that someone who is not a priest would be allowed into the courtyard of the priests would be by another priest. So none of the other disciples that we mentioned, the 12, were priests. They weren't from the Levites. They weren't of that priestly tribe. So they couldn't go in there. But we also know that Jesus didn't have just 12 disciples. We'll read a little bit later on that Jesus had a whole bunch of disciples. And when he went on the mountaintop and spent the whole night praying, afterwards, he chose 12 of those massive groups of disciples to be the apostles. You see what I'm saying here? So we know that Jesus had a whole bunch of disciples. It wasn't just the 12. He had a whole bunch of people that followed him. It was the 12 that he called to be apostles, men sent with a mission. But we also know that in order to gain access to this little courtyard area, you need to be a priest or have a priestly line. So if you do a little bit of research, this Lazarus character pops up again. And Lazarus translated is actually word is close to Elias, and that is actually the translated form of his word into the Greek. It is from the tribe of the Levites all the way back. So we see that there is a connection here. So the other disciple here, who is not John, the speculation, again, this is speculation from commentaries, they say that this could be Lazarus, and Lazarus, as he's known to the other priests, because he has a priestly background, he is allowed in, and because he's bringing a friend, that is the only reason why they are allowed into the courtyard. Otherwise, Peter would be denied access at all costs. There's no way he being, there's no way. There's just no way. So that's the speculation. That's how some of the assumption is made that Peter ended up in this courtyard of the high priests. That one's for free. So the high priest tore his clothes and said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy." Now we go back to Peter in verse 66. As Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him. Obviously, this is an odd situation. And said, "You also were with Jesus of Nazareth." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you are saying." And he went out on the porch, and a rooster crowed. Cock-a-doodle-doo. And the servant girl saw him again and began to say to those who stood by, "This is one of them." But he denied it again. And a little later on, those who stood by said to Peter again, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech, your accent, it shows it." Then he began to curse, and he began to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." Peter was pretty fiery. A second time, the rooster crowed, cock-a-doodle-doo. Then Peter called to mind the word that Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And then he thought about it, and he wept. And you can bet he wept, and he wept, and he wept. If you read the Bible, which I hope you do, and if you read the Gospels, which is a great place to start, and if you're with us and following us in the book of Mark, you would have seen that in the book of Mark, there are the 12 disciples that we talked about. Jesus is really the main character in any of the Gospels that you read. But throughout the Gospels, we see different disciples playing major key roles. And one of those major key roles is played by none other than Peter himself. So the main question I have is Peter, who is this close disciple, this close follower of Jesus, he's an apostle. How in the world does he get to the point of, well, let's look at it. Peter, when he was called to be a disciple, he was fishing. And what did he say? He dropped everything. Jesus says, hey, you, come follow me. Okay, let's go. His security, his finances, his livelihood, his only means of supporting himself, he left at the drop of a hat to follow a man, to follow this Jesus, to live a life of faith. This is Peter we're talking about. How could Peter, the man who left everything to follow Jesus, deny him 3 times before his death? I'm not talking like little slip-ups being like, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, who's that guy? Oh, must be, I think I know what you're talking. It was 3 outright denials. It was cognitive. He had to think about it. He had to choose the words in his mind when he was approached on who this Jesus character, or if he followed this Jesus character. His words were specific. I do not know the man. I don't know what you're talking about. And then he got vehement. He got upset. He's like, I know nothing. He started to swear and he started to curse. It just doesn't seem like the same Peter that dropped everything to follow Jesus. So let's take a few minutes this morning and talk about Peter. Because I got to figure this out. If you're as confused as I am, it just doesn't make any sense. Let's look at Peter. Like I said earlier, Mark 1 talks about choosing of the disciples and the specific nature in which that was done. We see that Peter was a fisherman who immediately left everything to follow Jesus. Now, he gave everything up to follow in this life of faith, not knowing where his next meal would come from, but knowing that Jesus, whom he followed, would take care of everything. You want to talk about a life of faith? That right there is a life of faith. If you have your Bibles, turn to Luke 6, 12 to 13. In Luke 6, we read that he was also chosen, like I said earlier, to be an apostle by Jesus after an all-night prayer meeting. You may not even know this exists, but let's just take a look at Luke chapter 6, verse 12 to 13, and I'll read it for you because it's absolutely fascinating. Luke 6, 12 to 13. Now it came to pass in those days that he, meaning Jesus, went out to the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer to God. All night in prayer to God. How many of you have ever prayed all night to God? How many of you have actually stayed awake all night? Those of you with kids, right? How many of you have stayed awake all night to talk to your spouse? Okay, maybe when you were dating, you got on the phone for like an hour, maybe 2 tops. But all night, yeah, here's Jesus in an all-night prayer vigil with his Father. Think about that one. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself. And from them, so from this massive group of disciples, he chose 12, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew was his brother, James and John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, Simon the Zealot, Judas, son of James, Judas Iscariot, who also became the traitor. Glad they put that in there. So this is the deal. Jesus has this all-night prayer vigil talking to God the Father, and then at the end of that, he chooses 12 to be apostles, 12 to be the most intimate, close people that followed him every single step of the way. Those that would be known in the day. The Jewish history teaches us that a common phrase was to be covered in their dust. To be covered in the dust of your rabbi was a significant thing because it meant that that's how close you were following. Because it was all dusty there. There were sandals, and whenever you're walking, you're kicking up the dust. So you were following so close to him that you would be caked in his dust. And you would know that they were followers of this specific rabbi because of the amount of dust that they had literally caked on them. It was true. This is how they did it. And so we read in Mark chapter 14 here, the beginning of it, what do we read? And it's a significant moment. That the once Peter the once who followed so closely, that literally tasted the dust as it was coming off the ground, and in this arid climate, this Peter, as he's following Jesus, all of a sudden now we read specifically, and Peter followed from a distance. How many of us, think about this, how many of us at one point we followed Jesus? I mean, we followed Jesus. We followed him. We were the ones that, we were at church If church started at 10:30, we were there at 10 a.m. because we couldn't wait to get there. If something was happening in the city that glorified God, we were the first ones to sign up. How many of us that there was a moment in our lives where being a Christian, following Jesus, was everything that we could think about? It was our life's passion. And how often does that passion lose its intensity? And have we become a generation that, like Peter, we still follow him? But we're keeping our space now. We're just, that dust, I don't know if I like that dust. I don't know if I like being caked in the dust of kicking up from the shoes of Jesus. I don't know if I like that. We follow him at a distance when Jesus is calling us to follow him because he sticks closer than a friend. But think about that. Think about your life right now. And think about your love for Jesus. Think about this. If you were one of those disciples following Jesus, do you ever wonder if you would have been one of the 12 that he chose? I don't think I would have been. I don't know, man. Some of you guys may be way better than me. But do you ever think about that? Like, would you have been one of the 12 that he chose and said, yeah, you come follow me? Because you got to think, all of these 12 ended up planting churches. Well, not all of the 12, because one we know. But you get the idea that all of these disciples ended up being the church planters for the New Testament church. So he had to choose the people that he knew could hack it. The people that... So how did Peter get in that? If Peter now is following at a distance and Peter's ultimately denying him, and we know that in the New Testament, Peter was one of the greatest church fathers of the New Testament church, something's not adding up here. I thought you chose the best of the best. You spent all night in prayer, Jesus. Peter, he was the oldest of the 12, and often he was a spokesperson for them. He would be the guy that they would look to because a lot of them were younger. Some of them were even ages 15 and 16, but Peter was the oldest guy there. Jesus also gave, in Mark chapter 10, he gave Peter a new name. Well, he twice, because it was Simon Peter, then he just started calling him, he said, Simon Peter, you're going to start calling him Peter. And then Peter eventually became Caiaphas, which we know was translated into the rock. And he said to Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. And now we know from history that it could have been where Jesus was located with them because they were standing with the disciples at the worship grounds at this big rock cavern. It's still in history today. It's still over in Israel, where they worship the god Pan. And so his disciples walk in, and they're stopping at this place, and Jesus is saying this double entendre kind of deal to Peter. Yeah, I'm naming you Peter upon, meaning the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. And so the double entendre there, the double meaning is that upon the rock, people like Peter, and upon this rock, places where you don't expect churches to be raised. And so he had this name change, and the symbolism behind that was huge. Peter, he's the only man in history that can ever say, I walk on water. Right? This is like Peter. He fell, and he kind of got swallowed up a little bit. Jesus kind of had to help her. But let's not forget, for a few moments, Peter, the dude's walking on water. He walked on water. Think about that. No one ever who has ever lived can say that. Jesus can. But no other. Where were the other disciples? I don't see the other disciples clambering after Peter's feet, jumping out of the boat, being like, yo, let's do this. No. Peter had enough faith. He had enough something within him, enough trust, that if he saw his leader doing it, he could do it. Like, say what you will, he fell into the ground, into the ocean and the sea and all that. Say that you will, but he actually, for a few moments, walked on water. Peter was also the same guy that in, somewhere in Mark, Mark 8, Jesus asks his disciples, and he says, who do people say that I am? And they're like, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're Moses, some say you're just another prophet. But then Jesus says, no. Who do you say that I am? Peter speaks up. He says, you're Jesus. you are Jesus the Christ. In that short phrase, he affirmed everything that Jesus was. He said Jesus. Because, let's go back a little bit. Even the disciples struggled with this sight and clarity thing, right? Because the disciples, they still viewed Jesus, the Messiah, as someone who would come to rid them of Roman rule and Roman oppression. They didn't quite understand the whole spiritual significance behind it. And so part of the whole New Testament, part of the whole beginning of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John Gospels was to show the disciples, not just the whole people, but to show the disciples, that Jesus was in fact the Christ, the coming Messiah, who is greater than the physical. He was over all the spiritual. And what does Peter respond? Peter says, you're Jesus, you are the Christ. At this moment, Peter moved from sight to clarity. He had the understanding that Jesus was the Christ. And this was a major theme in the whole book of Mark. Peter was the man, okay? Let's just say it, call it what it is. I mean, that guy was the man. He's like the go-to guy. He was like, if I could think of any, I don't know. He'd be like the Billy Graham of the day back then. As far as, people that follow Jesus, that have the ultimate respect and authority, I think Billy Graham is one of those figures in our culture, in our world today who has that. And I think Peter was kind of like that. He was kind of like the Billy Graham of the day. People looked up to him, people respected him. He followed Jesus. So then how did he come to deny Jesus? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Okay, let's back up to Mark 14, verses 27 to 31, okay? Mark 14. We're going to talk a little bit about Jesus predicting Peter's denial. In verse 27, Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble. He's talking to his disciples. Because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have been raised, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to him, Jesus, even if all are made to stumble, yet I will not be. Jesus said to him, simmer down, Peter. Assuredly, I say to you, Peter, that today, even this night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Peter's a hothead, but he spoke more vehemently. If I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all agreed with Peter. So this is the phrase, this is the moment where Jesus tells Peter, not once but twice, hey, listen, buddy, it's gonna happen. And Peter somehow, even after hearing Jesus tell him these things, he has the audacity to speak against Jesus. Because we know that Jesus could not tell a lie. Jesus spoke truth and only truth. As a follower of Jesus Christ, Peter would have known this, yet at the same time, when he hears those words that he's going to fall, he's going to deny him, he still vehemently denies the truth that is coming out of Jesus' mouth. Look at his reaction here. You almost get the sense that there's something deeper going on here. His reaction is so strong. It's so almost bitter. Like the words coming out of his mouth. You can just picture yourself in that moment that what he's saying to Jesus right now is just coming out of a heart that is so filled with what? Pride. It's not overzealousness. It's not boastfulness. It's pride. It was simply pride, human pride, that caused Peter to speak out against Jesus and contradict the truth that had already come out of Jesus' mouth. And so again, we see pride rear its ugly, ugly head. That dirty, dirty root of original sin all the way back in the Garden of Eden. I don't know why Peter did the things that he did. Maybe he was frustrated. Maybe he felt he had something to prove because, yeah, he walked on water, but he ended up, falling in the water and sinking. And maybe there was something within him that rose up and said, no, I've got to be a better follower of Christ. I've got to do things better. I know I'm struggling here, but I've got to stand up and be a better follower of Christ. I can do better. I've got to be the best. I've got to be maybe there was some of that stuff going through his mind, but what do we know about pride? Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. 1 Corinthians 10:12, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Failing to heed the warning of Jesus, Peter stepped right into the path of a spiritual freight train called pride. He could have said to Jesus, he could have said, man, Jesus, what can I do? I don't want to do that. Those are words, I know those are true, but how do I get out of this? Can you help me out here? I don't want to deny you. Can you give me a chance here? But no, he didn't do that. His pride took over, and we don't know the exact root of this, but we know that it was pride that took over and caused him to say, I will not deny you. The propensity to sin is always there, whether you're Peter or you're Josh. It's always there. For us to deny that propensity to sin is to speak life to pride. The propensity to sin, don't ever say to me, I could never do that. When you look at the news and you see all the degradation going on, all the desecration and everything, you're looking at our society and you're looking at them being like, oh, they're the worst people in the world. I could never be that. That's pride. You could. Don't ever think for a moment that you couldn't, because each and every one of us has the propensity to sin and to sin worse. That's the root of sin. That's the root that Jesus Christ died for. But each and every one of us in our humanity, in our sinful humanity, we have the propensity to sin as everyone else does. The worst of the worst of the worst. It was for Peter, and it was for you, and it is for me. A far better response is, Lord, I know I'm vulnerable to all areas of sin. So please hold me and keep me in your arms of love and protection. One commentator says this, believers, we never outgrow the need for absolute dependence upon the Lord. He is to be relied upon, trusted in, looked to, and depended upon in every setting and phase of life. You see, at this point, Peter didn't get it, but later he would, because we know that in 1 Peter 5:5-7, he teaches people as he's now planting this church, as he's now one of the fathers of the church. See, there was forgiveness. There was a whole transition that happened. He's now at the other side, and he's saying, listen, I've been there. I know what it is to let pride control you. And I know what it is to have everything, well up within you, and you just want to do the best, but you just let, I know, I've been there. And he warns them, and he says, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Peter's fall was not forever. And then lastly, this commentator says this, after he denies Christ, Peter drops out of the picture. We know nothing more about what happened to him until the women come with the good news of the resurrection. Peter repented of his sin, and the Lord forgave him and continued to use him. Peter was the first apostle to publicly preach the gospel after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what? 3,000 were added to the church, to the kingdom of God in one day. He was the first to have the Holy Spirit work through him in miraculous ways. So at the end of the day, you and I, we can relate to Peter. Because if a guy like Peter, who doesn't have it all together, who doesn't have everything, boom, 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 well, I can relate to that. That makes Christianity seem to me, it makes Christianity that much more attainable. Because there is grace. There is forgiveness. No matter, sir or ma'am, how many times, or kid in here, no matter how many times you've denied Christ, he will take you back. No matter how many times you've denied him in your past, today he says to you, come to me. Come to me. I can still use you. Repent. I can still use you. Because that's what he did to Peter. He took a guy who was a hothead, who denied him 3 times. 3 times. And he still said, Peter, I need you to preach. I need you to speak this message on the inauguration of the Christian church in the New Testament. And guess what, Peter? I'm going to use you, and 3,000 people are come to know me because of you. If he can do that with a guy like Peter, he can certainly do it with a guy like me. And if he can do it with a guy like me, he can certainly do it for a guy like you or a woman like you.